Welcome back, everyone. In this section, we're going to explore the topic of inclusion. So often when we define inclusion, people think of not only diversity, but they think about the inclusion of all of the diverse perspectives, the diverse identities, right? It's not only, again, as people will often say, it's not only people being brought into a space, but it's really have an opportunity to share their voice in that space, to truly be included. You can think of it as being invited to a party or to a wedding. But once you arrive, the question becomes, are you included in activities? Do people include you in the conversation? Do you feel a part of that? And so, again, as we look at inclusion, we're going to unpack it a little bit, and we're going to start with this question. Can you think of a time in your life when you felt like you absolutely belonged? When you feel like you absolutely belonged? Even if it was only for a few minutes. Now, for some of us, we may have to go all the way back to like fifth grade summer camp, and that's okay, right? And for some of us, it may be with family. Others, it may have been on an athletic team. For some of us, it may have been in college. But can you think of a time in your life when you felt like you absolutely belonged? And if not, that's okay as well. But take note of that. Here's some follow up questions. What was it that caused you to feel this way? And how did that allow you to show up? One of the places that I feel like I absolutely belong is with my immediate family. I like to call myself a very social introvert, meaning I like being around people for a period of time. And then I kind of need a break to recharge my battery a little bit. So, I'm really good for showing up at the get together, the party, the social event because I love being around people. I love seeing people, and all of that is great. And then after an hour or so, I've kind of had enough. Well, my family knows this about me. And so they don't judge me for it. As a matter of fact, my wife, she was considering this was pre-COVID. My birthday is in February. And so this was pre-COVID. And we were having a conversation around my 40th birthday. She said, I'm considering throwing you a party, but I wanted to talk to you first. So, okay. What? She said, would you be okay with it? I said, I would love to do a party. And we had a conversation about it, and because we had so many things going on that year in February around my birthday, we said let's push it out into March because I was hosting a conference, I was traveling to DC and speaking at another conference and stuff like that. So we said let's push it out into March. So unfortunately it didn't happen the way that we had planned, but my point of the story is I said I would love to have a party as long as you're okay with me leaving the party early. And she said, no problem at all. I figured that would be the case. I'm thinking about, having the dinner portion from 6 to 8. That way you can see everyone and talk to everyone. And I figured you'd be leaving around 8:30. Everyone else can stay and dance and stuff. I'll have a band come in and, they can stay until 10 and then we'll close up. I said, that sounds wonderful, right? So what was it that caused me to feel this way? Again, it's the fact that I'm accepted for who I am. How does it allow me to show up? Oh, I feel free. I'm not in my head worrying about what people will think or being judged or what happens if I, have to leave early or what happens if I, do this or do that. Like it allows me so much freedom. It allows me to bring my best self to that space. It allows me to tap into all of my creativity because I'm not thinking about other things. And so I want you to spend a moment just thinking about a time in your life when you felt like you absolutely belonged. Thank you. Now, as you thought about that and you thought about how it allowed you to show up, here's my next question. Don't we want that for every child who walks into our classrooms, our buildings, our after school programs, to experience that feeling of belonging? What would that do for someone's ability to learn if they were experiencing belonging and didn't have to worry about being judged, if they didn't have to be in their head about all of these other things? Imagine what type of environment we could create, what type of experience we could create if people could just experience belonging. I want you now to move to this conversation, and we're going to talk about three really important words, and that is from invitation to inclusion to belonging. And I just have a couple of really quick questions, and that is, do these naturally lead to the next? And are they the same thing? If you're saying no, well, then think about and maybe jot down some thoughts to what is the difference between invitation, inclusion, and belonging? How do you see them as being different? And then, secondly, again, does one naturally lead to the next? So often, what I hear from people around this topic, around invitation, inclusion, belonging, is this, that one is necessary for the next, but they don't naturally equal the next. Meaning it's very difficult to have inclusion if you don't start with invitation, and it's impossible to experience belonging if you're not inclusive. But just because you invite people doesn't guarantee that they will feel included. And just because you include people, it doesn't guarantee that they will feel like they actually belong. Some examples of that might be, when we think about being invited to, again, a party or a wedding or some type of social function, we've been invited. But once you show up, the question is, do you feel included? Does the host take the time to include you, to introduce you to people? And then if they do, it increases the likelihood that we will actually experience some of that belonging. But belonging can take time. It doesn't always happen right away, and it doesn't happen overnight. Belonging requires sometimes trust, right? Will they really accept me for who I am? Can I take the mask off? But so often, I find that schools and districts and other organizations, they confuse invitation and inclusion. And they think that simply because they are inviting people that they've been inclusive. So they'll say things to me like, hey, we invited everyone to the back to school night. So we've been inclusive. We're inclusive. We invited everyone. The question is, have we truly been inclusive? So let me give you a short story on this just to help highlight inclusion. We were working with the district once, and as we were doing some of this work, we went in and we asked, what's one of your major barriers? And they said, well, we're having really low parent turnout. So to what? And they said to everything, to back to school nights, to family dinners, parents aren't showing up for anything. We said, well, why do you think that is? And the response was, well, people here just don't value education. We said, why? And they said, and I'll just share, they said, well, because this is Las Vegas. And, you can make $80,000 a year here parking a car. So people just don't value education. Now, this was not the whole district. This was a couple schools that we're working with. Okay. We're hearing the same thing from both schools. So me and the team, we decide that we need to definitely get some family perspective on this. So we asked if we can have access to, some of the phone numbers, and we began to make phone calls, see if we can reach some of the families and ask them, what's keeping them from showing up to these events. And as we sat and we called, we kept getting everyone's voicemail. No one seemed to be picking up the phone. We called all night as late as we could up until dinner time. And we sat down at dinner, myself and two other teammates. And as we're talking, we're just sharing our experience that out of all the phone calls we maybe had talked to 4 families. Not very hopeful, not what we wanted at all. And so no one had called us back, though we had left our numbers. It had been several hours since we had started calling. We just weren't having success. So I'm starting to strategize the next day about what our approach is going to be. And the strangest thing begins to happen. The following day at 6:30 in the morning, our phones begin to ring. Who's on the other end? Parents. And what are they saying to us? Thank you so much for calling. I'm sorry it took me so long to return your call, but I'm just getting off work. We missed it. See, during this time in Las Vegas, The most lucrative time to work was to work late at night. Most of the parents that from the school that we were calling worked on the strip. They worked in casinos. They worked in the hotels. And the most lucrative time to work was in the evening time because that's when people were there and when people would tip. Also, during this time, a lot of the hotels would not hire people full time. And so, a lot of parents, what they were doing is they would work a part time shift at one hotel or casino and then work a part time shift at another. And so, they weren't just working 8 hour shifts. A lot of times, they would be gone from home for 10 to 12 hours because they would work 4 to 5 hours at one place, have a 2 or 3 hour gap, and then work 4 to 5 hours at another place. And so as we began speaking to them, they said it's not that we don't care, it's that we simply can't make it there at 6 p.m. because we're working. We're working from 6 to 6. And so we began asking them questions. Well, what can we do? And they said, well, could we do a breakfast instead? Huh. Hadn't really considered that. So we go back to the schools and we said, here's what we want to do. Instead of doing parent and family dinners, we want to do family breakfasts. They said, well, that's not what we do. We said, well, it's true. And that's why we might be getting the results that we get. So we said, we're going to do breakfasts. We did it, and folks, no joke, those families showed up and they packed out the cafeteria. And it was great. It was amazing. They were showing up. But then we began hearing more. And so we kept the conversations going. And some people said, thanks for switching it to a breakfast, but I have to admit, this has also been a hardship because I haven't seen my child since 6 o'clock last night. And this morning I came directly here from my shift. So I had to choose between going home and seeing my child for an hour before they leave for school or coming to this meeting. So we said, well, what might make it easier? And someone said, well, could we host these during the weekend, like on a Saturday? So we go back and we talk to the leadership, and they said, well, no, of course not. They have to be during, the week. That's just only time that we can host them. That's how we've always done things. And we said, but the families, if you truly want family engagement, they're saying, could they be done on the weekend? And so we started hosting them on the weekend, and no joke, they grew again. But then someone else said, question, why do these always need to happen at the school building? So we said, well, what do you mean? They said, why can't they happen in the community? And we said, well, are there places in the community that people already gather? And they said, absolutely. They listed several things, and they listed churches and community centers. They said, well, we have, gatherings there all the time, and it would help people, and people wouldn't have to figure out transportation, and they would feel comfortable, more comfortable there than coming here. And so we went back and talked to the team and the leadership team again, and they said, okay, we'll do it. And once again, it grew. But here was the thing. That is when we made the switch from inclusion, because when we switched to breakfasts, we realized that we couldn't just do away from dinners because that wouldn't be inclusive either. So we needed to hold breakfasts and dinners to be inclusive. But once we moved to the community centers, we started to experience belonging. And here's how we could tell. We no longer had to make up the flyers because the community designed the flyers. We no longer had to figure out the menu because they figured out the menu. We no longer had to advertise because they went door to door and said, we are having a meeting Saturday at the center. You need to be there. That's the difference between invitation, inclusion, and belonging. Families weren't showing up in the beginning. They thought they were being inclusive, and they would even say things like, we put the flyers in Spanish, so of course we're being inclusive. Folks, that's a check the box strategy. It was invitation. And please hear me out. Being inclusive with your language is extremely important, but it does not equal full inclusion. It's a step towards inclusion. So they were stuck in invitation. They were inviting people to things, but they hadn't taken into consideration the barriers that would keep people from being able to participate. And once those were recognized, we experienced inclusion. But once we built relationship, it moved from inclusion to belonging. Those families now felt like they belonged, and they felt like they were a part of the school system. That's what we truly want. So as we talk about, diversity, as we talk about inclusion, it takes more consideration than just invitation. Consider, how can we be more inclusive to lead to belonging? Because once we hit belonging again, it's amazing how people show up.